Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's a review of sorts of their School of Chromatic Elements subclass supplement for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I normally would be cautious about doing such a thing. It's kind of like a review in a way, but Lordrusty asked me beforehand. And as I thought about it, I would like to take a moment to say that I feel like it's a little overly defensive of me to act like we can't do a review of a thing you made for money in this context. Like the business person in me says, well, it's a bad policy because what if a lot of people do that? And then Parley will be flooded with that thing. But you know what? You are then paying me to listen for your enjoyment to an ad of your thing that you like. Maybe just for the sake of commercialism or whatever, but I could always reject them on a case by case basis. And I won't need to do that often because mostly people requesting Parley will be people who are like deep into the things that I make and therefore want Parley to be good and therefore wouldn't shift it toward being like ads and stuff. So maybe it's overly stuffy of me to say, I don't know if that's a good idea, even though this one is a fine idea. I want to talk about this specific piece, so what's the big deal? Why am I so worried about all of you? No, it's fine. And if it does happen that now and again, sure, with lots of people coming in, maybe somebody would try to use it as just the way to plug themselves, and I would just say no, and it's fine. So I think it's fine, which is why I said it's fine. But Lordrusty asked me first. I wanted to briefly discuss that. It begins. Hey, Zandy, I put out my first piece of self-published homebrew up for sale this month. I'd like to use my Parley to ask you to review it. It's called The School of Chromatic Elements, and it's published under my real name, Russell Stevens. It features a new wizard subclass, a new character background, some new spells, and an item designed to work well with the new subclass. Some of the parts of this supplement might be familiar from previous Parleys, where you had to look at pre-playtest versions of the subclass and spells. We've already discussed this through direct message, and I've sent you a review copy, so I don't think I need to go into too much more detail here. Nope. Feel free to take this whichever direction you like. It's almost an ad, and I don't want to push any talking points on you. Indeed, I would imagine part of the reason that you would ask me to do this is because you know that I will give you negative feedback that is coming from a place of affection rather than hatred, which is surprisingly difficult to get otherwise. Or negative feedback that is in the spirit of the positive things. People often have a tendency to one of many reasons most people don't make good reviewers is that they decide whether the thing is good or bad and then review it based on it's bad and therefore here's all the bad things. They're not very balanced reviews, or even if they include good things, they're like in spite of, this is like the good thing that would be here if only it weren't bad, which it is, and here are the bad things. That's not useful. I'm going to try to give you my balanced feelings, good and bad, and in between, about what I think. Cool. So it's the supplement includes a wizard subclass called the School of Chromatic Elements Wizard, which is like a wizard that has studied, wizards learn their magic by studying, a wizard that has studied sorcerer magic. Interesting. And specifically elemental damage type sorcerer magic. There's a magic item that rewards you for casting spells of different elements once per day to get bonus effects, pretty powerful bonus effects, for casting a spell of a given elemental type, again, once per day. So you're rewarded most if you can cast like one lightning spell per day, one thunder spell per day, one poison spell per day. You get a big bonus effect for that first one. And then if you could go through all of them, you could get quite a lot of bonuses throughout the day, but you'd have to use an eclectic mix of spells. Cool stuff. There's a background. The background is like you were raised with a family of sorcerers, but you are not a sorcerer, or at least not yet. And you get some cool features and some good role-playing prompts for doing that. I really like the background. I think it's cool. And in general, I think that the biggest praise I have for this supplement is I think your flavor is really nailing it in a lot of places. I think it's good role-playing stuff. The balance I also have a lot of respect for. There are a couple of spells as well. Two that are meant to be used. They kind of flesh out the list of available elemental spells for the subclass, one in particular. And a third one that is a weird addition, but we'll get to that when we get there. It's still an interesting spell. Finally, before we get into specifics, I want to describe briefly how I will evaluate this piece, though I don't think that this is a very opinionated way to evaluate something. I feel like this is just the things that literally are objectively important to it. But there is going to be a note about tone, because this is for a general audience. You're selling this. This is available for sale for general audiences. It's not for your playgroup alone. You're giving it to other people for them to use. That changes some things, especially compared to when we've talked about some of this stuff in past Parley. I'm mostly going to be evaluating, I mean, the goal is fun. And two things that can help things be fun are flavor and balance. Balance, people think this dirty word, but balance can obviously, not to be blunt, but fairly obviously help things be fun by making it so options don't feel so powerful that it's like frustrating and not an interesting decision to take them. You're meant to choose, so why should one option be clearly better than the others? It's if you're either meant to choose or not. If you're meant to choose, it ought to be a reasonable choice, but not clearly better than other things. And of course, if something is underpowered and you think it sounds fun, it doesn't feel great when you stick your life on the line as an adventurer and the thing you thought would be badass, doesn't save you and you die. Or the dungeon master has to handwave something or whatever. So balance, good, though I think you did a good job where features feel like they will work for the player. I think the amount of damage they do, for example, is good in this supplement. And flavor, basically, like, does it feel like a clear embodiment of a fantasy? Though another element of flavor is, does this feel redundant with a lot of other parts of 5th edition? Not really your fault, but 5th edition has a lot of stuff in it. There are a lot of subclasses. They keep putting out books because that makes money, and therefore there is a lot of stuff. And so it's not entirely your fault where some of these things are a little redundant with other parts of 5th edition. However, the most redundant bit is sorcerers of various couple kinds of sorcerers. I think that the difference between chromatic elements school wizards here and some sorcerers, like draconic sorcerers using metamagic to change the element of their spells, is that your fantasy for this subclass, the fantasy you're offering to the player, appears to be intended to be that you use a little bit of a bunch of different chromatic elements rather than focusing on one specific element. I don't think this subclass currently does that exactly, but I think that's what you were trying to achieve. And so my primary criticism is going to be where I don't think it does that and how you could perhaps make it so it did. My primary praise is that using rainbow colored spells as a pattern of play sounds cool. It would provide benefits for using a variety of spells, which I think as a fantasy a lot of people would really enjoy. That sounds fun. I want to play something like that, but it's just bad in 5th edition. And so marrying that fun fantasy with something that also has gameplay effectiveness, I'm totally sold on that being a good thing to do. I only have mixed feelings about how well you've done that. So we'll get into it. I'm first going to talk about the subclass, then a little bit about the magic item, and a little bit about the spells, and we're going to cover the background last. I think it's really, really cool, but it's the least related to those other things. Maybe we'll also cover that one spell at the end as well. Anyway, if anything is going to not get enough time, I want it to be those, not because they're bad, but just because I have less to say, and like bluntly, the background I think is just really cool, and I would like to tell you about it, but I have very little to add, and that other spell feels kind of like a random inclusion, but I still have things to say, so we'll see if we get there. Okay, Scroll of Chromatic Elements. I'm going to read you the little blurb as a way to kind of frame the discussion, but I'll mostly be saying things in my own words. The School of Chromatic Elements is dedicated to commanding the elements. Chromatic element wizards apply themselves to the study of sorceress magic, particularly wild magic and draconic sorcerers. By learning the movements to which these elements ebb and flow, a skilled practitioner can attune to this fluctuation through meditation, allowing them to alter their spells and protect themselves from the elements. I'd like to note that little bit at the end about protecting yourself from the elements. At the moment, I think that's a rather large focus of this subclass. Not necessarily a bad thing, just a thought. You are a wizard, a squishy wizard, so that's a thought. Anyway, Okay, so there's a pair of features, each at level 2, level 6, level 10, and level 14. Level 2, you get an additional chromatic damage cantrip. So here, chromatic has been keyworded. I think that's a good choice. You know, in 5th edition generally, chromatic element damage like is a thing. Spells will say acid, cold, fire, lightning, thunder, poison damage. And it's kind of loosely implied that those are like the chromatic damage types. But here you've actually made that into a keyword that the subclass will use. 5th edition all but does this already, so I think that's good, useful. So chromatic element damage cantrip, like acid splash, poison spray, firebolt, whatever. You get an additional cantrip, very sorcery, okay. And you can add 2 of the following spells to your spellbook in addition to any spells gained at this level. Absorb Elements, Chromatic Orb, and Chromatic Convergence, which is a spell you made up in this supplement. We'll get to it in a little bit. But it's not totally dissimilar from Chromatic Orb. You just make pillars of the energy that can then be slammed together. We'll talk about it in a little more detail later. But yeah, it's a very this subclass themed spell. An important part of having access to these spells is that you gain a spell or 2 or 3 at first level that gives you the ability to cast leveled spells that are of any chromatic element damage type from the start. We'll get back to that. And then the big feature, Elemental Attunement. This is like the key thing the class plays around. So at the beginning of the day, you can attune to an element. You either roll a d6, and then you get, you know, acid, cold, fire, lightning, poison, thunder, depending on what you roll, or you just pick one of those. As it's worded, you can roll or pick. And when you're attuned to the element, you resist that damage type. So whole day, you resist fire damage. You know you're going to fight fire elementals, pick fire at the beginning of the day, resist fire damage for the whole day. Pretty powerful. Defensively. And whenever you cast a leveled spell, so first level or higher spell, that has a chromatic element damage type, so you cast an acid spell, for example, you can make it be the spell type you're attuned to instead, for no cost, as often as you want. So if you cast, you know, Burning Hands or whatever, and you're attuned to lightning, you can make it do lightning damage without paying any cost. It just does do lightning damage for the whole day. And remember, as worded, you can choose which damage type this is. My initial problem with this feature is that as worded, it doesn't do anything most of the time. You either don't know what enemies you're going to face, so you can't make an informed decision, and you don't gain anything by the spells being a different element. It doesn't actually gain you anything unless you have like a multi-class or spell damage type related plan, in which case picking a specific damage type, the same damage type, every single time would have a lot of offense benefits. But neither of those things seems to be the benefit intended by this feature. I think you are interested in players enjoying switching damage types, and this isn't going to get players to do that, at least not yet. We'll get to those features a little later. It's going to encourage people to multi-class into Draconic Sorcerer and make a big bongo fire damage build with the Elemental Adept feat. Now, that's okay. Not everyone will multi-class, by the way. You know, it's a subclass intended for general audiences, so to some extent it's probably good to assume less people will multi-class. I'm not going to argue the statistics because I don't know them, but I think it's good that the feature work primarily by itself, and at the moment the main benefit is it's very clearly really good if you make a build like that, but doesn't really do anything if you don't make a build like that. At second level at least, you arguably gain just about nothing from this subclass, which I think is not good. You're going to go on to give us a couple of different damage boosts for attuning elements, like changing a spell's element to a certain type that you're attuned to, or casting a cantrip of the type you are attuned to, and I think that those benefits would be very beneficial if you move them up. I want one of them at second level, because at the moment, this is a lot of splendor for no real gain, and you can't yet like choose during combat what element to be attuned to, so the defensive benefits are not really there either. I do not like the way the features are organized, but I'm going to go on to enjoy some of the features you've added. So 6th level, once per long rest, you could change the damage type you're attuned to as a reaction to taking the damage. a minor kind of grammar squabble. Do you have to take the damage first and then you pay the reaction and then you attune? Or am I meant to assume that it's like absorb elements, but you know, it's just your attunement feature? This is interesting. So it means that once per long rest, if you do encounter those fire elementals, now you can reactively attune to that and have resistance to fire damage. Although, now if there are any offensive benefits to casting spells of the damage type you're attuned to, you won't get them because the fire elemental it's immune to fire damage. And in many cases, creatures are resistant or immune to damage types they deal. So unless you're fighting spellcasters, like just a human that is casting elemental spells, this is not bad. I mean, you get resistance to the damage type. It's good, but a big trade-off. You have to not use half of the subclass in order to get the defensive benefit. And again, from a defensive perspective, the subclass is more or less useless until you get this feature. You have to be able to say, I'm going to commit to the defensive mode, attuned to a defensive element, or it doesn't, that isn't protecting you. But also like to briefly point out that since you have access to absorb elements from second level, if you want it, there's this interesting thing where absorb elements, if you're not familiar, is a reaction spell that gives you resistance to a damage type, and then you do a little more of it the next time you attack. But the way that elemental attunement gives you damage defense against the type you attune to is also resistance. Most players would rule that doesn't stack. I might rule that you get immunity, but I might not. I think it would be interesting if instead you did something like when you're attuned to an element, you take less damage of that element's type equal to your proficiency bonus or a proficiency dice. And therefore it stacks with absorb elements. I think that could be cool. It's powerful, but in exchange for, you have to do a leveled spell and attune to the element. You have to pay a decent amount of cost. You also can't do those at the same time. You encounter a fire elemental. Round 1, you can attune, and now you have resistance, or you have your proficiency armor against that element type if you change it to mine. And then round 2, you can cast absorb elements and take resistance, halved damage, plus reduced damage equal to your proficiency modifier. I think that could be cool, and it has an appropriate cost, a couple of rounds, and you get significant defenses. That could be neat. If you want them to stack, that's a suggestion. Not really a problem. And then it says, once per short rest, you can expend one of your hit die. I like spending hit die as a resource for things like this. You can expend one of your hit die to re-roll on the elemental attunement table and change your elemental alignment type. Maybe I'm being picky, but you can pick or roll at the beginning of the day, but here during a short rest, you can only re-roll. It's not really a problem, but I'm sensing based on my complaint before, do you want players to be able to pick or not? I think you do not want players to be able to pick. I think you want it to be that they want to shuffle elements, and then that's rewarded somehow. But as it is, it's that you can pick at the beginning of the day, and so you either have a plan and you will pick, and then you will not change it for any of these benefits. That's bad. And you get benefits for not changing it too, because you could just cast absorb elements and then not spend a hit die. Or if you want to change your elements and get a benefit, you still don't get any benefit for doing that yet at this level, except chromatic cantrips. Beginning at 6th level, when you cast the cantrip that deals the damage type that you were attuned to, you add your intelligence modifier to the damage dealt. You also learn yet another additional cantrip that does chromatic damage from the wizard's spell list. So you can have, if you plan for it, basically all of them. Meaning you can always be switching your combat tactics to do an elemental damage type cantrip that you are currently attuned to. Almost always. You have 5 or 6 at this level. So you have almost all or all of them if you plan for it. But only here do you get any benefit for matching the element, and it's only on your cantrips, which unless you've planned for it, in which case you're just going to use the same cantrip that you were already going to use all the time. Intelligence modifier to the damage dealt is good. That's so you're adding like 3 or 4. I kind of want it to be that you get that bonus whenever you deal any damage that is the element you're attuned to, with a spell, with a weapon, with a leveled spell or a cantrip. Any damage you deal that is the element you're attuned to, you add your intelligence modifier to the damage from the start. and that elemental attunement is random. It's always random, unless you know, adaptive attunement. Now, if you're upset that you want people to be able to make the Draconic Sorcerer whatever build, I would like to point out that you can, you know, as it's worded, you can like fireball yourself and then absorb the fire damage, and then have that be, and then you do a fire spell casting build at the cost of a 3rd level spell slot or whatever, which that's an appropriate cost. One could cast Create Bonfire and then walk into it, or like light themselves on fire with a match and then use adaptive attunement to attune to that elemental damage. You could rule that it has to be a magic source of damage to get that under control, but Create Bonfire would still do it. So you can still do the Draconic Sorcerer, big bongo, one single element, probably fire damage spellcasting thing, if you want to, even if you make elemental attunement itself not allow you to choose. You always have to roll. So if you want to preserve that ability, you can, for not like a huge cost. Depending on how you move these features around, you might need to wait till 6th level, but anyway. If you wanted to keep that ability, but you also want the player to need to adapt, you could just make it so elemental attunement does not let you choose. You have to roll at the beginning of the day, and you get the intelligence modifier bonus from the start. You are very clearly encouraged to use a variety of different elemental spells. You're encouraged to learn different elemental spells. That'll feel really fun, I think. You get a reward for doing so, and there are situations where you might control it or choose to switch it to something else, choose to reroll, whatever. I would favor that approach. I think as is, it either doesn't do anything or doesn't do much for too long, or you will only use it when you're already min-maxing a specific element, which doesn't seem to be the approach you have in mind. Okay, 10th level. Once per short rest, when you use elemental attunement to alter the damage type of a spell, which is free, but once per short rest, when you do that, the spell does damage as if it was upcast 1 level. I would prefer this to be simplified so that it just is upcast 1 level. It feels needlessly complicated for it to do the damage it would do if it was upcast 1 level, but not do whatever else it would do if it was upcast 1 level. But possibly the peculiar wording there makes me think that you discovered there are problems if you allow that. I can't think what those would be. I think it's really cool if they're upcast 1 level. I would rather it was simpler and it just is upcast by 1 level. If it's a Chardalon's Stride or whatever, you get more fire damage when you run past people, but you also move faster. I just don't like, why not? And it's simpler that way. Okay, this is interesting. So another idea I have is that you could make it be that you can't change a spell to the elemental attunement type whenever you want. You always get the damage bonus. I was suggesting that before, but you can't change the damage type for free whenever you want. You can only change it once per short rest. But when you do that, the spell is upcast by 1 level as like a little bonus too. That kind of appeals to me. It feels a little more elegant too. That way it's not like you can change the spell whenever you want, but then only the first time you do that per short rest, you get additional damage. That's just a little bit of bookkeeping when I feel like it might not matter too much in practice, but not a big deal. It's pretty cool. I like the idea of, you have like heightened spell casting ability of the type you're attuned to. Pretty cool. Also, as a reaction, you can become immune to the type you're attuned to for 1 turn, once per short rest. Interesting. So basically a stronger version of adaptive attunement that you could use instead of or along with absorb elements to heavily resist incoming damage of a type. If you fight an elemental damage dealing opponent, you can extremely potently resist the damage they do to you. Remember that you can only adapt to incoming damage as a reaction once per long rest. So if an enemy spellcaster does damage to you, figures out you're resistant to it, and then does another type of damage, you have absorb elements if you took it, but you're otherwise a little stuck out. Not a bad thing necessarily. I'm just saying I think that's worth thinking about. Whereas against elemental creatures, you are incredibly durable. Like they have almost no chance of killing you. You're practically invulnerable to single element damage. Not necessarily bad. I'm just saying that's you are. Okay, 14th level features, and then we got to move on. You get 2 things. First one is you're attuned to 2 elements. So you roll twice and you re-roll if you get a duplicate, so you have 2. You can pick which one if there's a conflict, or you can use both or whatever. You get the bonus damage to cantrips for 2 elements, gives you some flexibility. This would allow you to potentially use elements that are more advantageous. You can adapt to an element defensively, but still have another element potentially to use offensively, fixing the fire elemental is immune to fire problem. Or it's not really a problem, but like that's a trade-off, and now it isn't as much of a trade-off, which is powerful. Cool, don't have too much to say. It lets you be attuned to 2 elements. Here's the bigger one. Okay, so at 14th level, you can pick 5 spells from your spellbook, you have to know them, that all deal chromatic element damage. 5 different spells. They can't be higher than 2nd level. You always have them prepared. They don't count against your number of spells prepared, and you can cast them all for free once per long rest at 2nd level. There's a couple of things here. If you pick 1st level spells, they're upcast for free, which in some cases is surprisingly strong. We'll get to that in a few minutes. I'm talking about chromatic convergence, but that's okay. 2, this is a weird one in that you get 5 2nd level spells for free once per long rest. You get 5 2nd level spell slots, but also at the same time you're level 14, and so you have a ton of spell slots. This is also interesting because you may have been inspired by sorcerers with sorcery points and Font of Magic reassigning their spell slots, like breaking up high-level spell slots to make a bunch of small ones. That might have been where some of the inspiration here came from, which I think is interesting. Again, it's a difficult feature to evaluate because so few people play at 14th level and beyond, and it gains you a lot of leveled spells every day, but only at a level at which you already have a lot of leveled spells per day. So it's a little difficult to evaluate the power level of this feature for me. It seems cool. One thing I like about it in theory is it means that if you prepare for it, you can pick a range of different elemental spells or many like variable element spells, Dragon's Breath and Chromatic Orb and Chromatic Convergence, and those are the ones I can think of right now. And then you can be sure that no matter which elements you're attuned to, you have powerful spells to do that with, or you could focus on a certain type or whatever. As it's worded, you can already change the elemental alignment of your spells as much as you want to the spells you're attuned to, but if you couldn't, which is what I suggested as a change, suddenly this feature has a very clear purpose. It ensures that you have spells of the relevant types if you want to. I think that would be very cool, that's all. Basically, the reason I critique this way is because it almost feels like you wrote this subclass assuming players would switch which element they were attuned to, but then in the wording for elemental attunement, you do allow them to choose, which I think most people probably would. And so I'm kind of assuming you wanted to encourage people to switch a lot, even though I don't think that much of this current set of features actually does encourage people to switch. I'm assuming you would like that, in which case I think this is a really good feature. It makes a lot of sense in a way. I also think it will feel very distinct, very sorcery maybe, to cast a lot of low-level spells. Pretty cool overall. I think this is a great example of how some small changes could make it feel way different for a lot of people. I hope it doesn't feel nitpicky. I'm focusing on these things this way because it isn't your table anymore. You know, this is a supplement you're selling to the general public. So I need to assume that people will interpret things in a like somewhat picky and overly focused on a certain interpretation thing, like people will. You know, at my table, I would just go, oh no, you can't pick what damage type. Like it's way, that's weird wording. The rest of the subclass seems to me as your DM to assume that you can't pick, so you can't pick. I don't care what it says. It's better design in my opinion, and it's my game if you can't pick. Like that's what I would do. It's not really a problem for me. I would read this supplement and go, that's weird. Oh, whatever, I'll just say they can't pick. And then it's awesome. And then I would go from there. Or like I would reorganize the features at will, and it would be no big deal to me. But as a supplement for a general audience, I think that would not be a good criticism. I think or a good critique. I think it would be better to say, no, I would say that is a problem if it's going to be for an unknown audience. And it's easy to fix. You know, you can change the wording or fiddle around with feature positions. Which brings me to the pendant, the Amulet of Elemental Mastery. So this is a magic item that you included that's meant to be good with the subclass. My shtick here is this is like a better subclass than the subclass for encouraging the player to cast many different spells. I'm going to read it. At the beginning anyway. This item can be used as an arcane focus. This small hexagonal pendant is embedded with up to 6 differently colored spherical gems associated with a different chromatic damage type each. When you deal damage with a spell using the amulet, like you have the element or you're casting with the amulet, and you do damage with a spell, you can use a gem to change the damage type and impose an additional effect listed on the amulet gem table. Unless stated otherwise, all additional effects last for 1 minute, use your spell saving throw DC, and can only be used once, regaining their abilities at dawn. Just to give you an idea, the lightning one, for example, says creatures within 10 feet of a target hit by the spell have to pass a dex save or they take 1d10 lightning damage as it arcs out from the target. Chain lightning happens. I have a couple of things here. First of all, on the surface, it seems like it encourages you to do a spell of each different element during the day, but actually it lets you change the spell's damage type to that type. So you needn't. You can just do the 6 firebolts, and 6 times per day you change them to a damage type and get an additional effect. I think it would be more fun for a lot of people if you can't change their damage type. You have to do damage of that damage type, and then once per day, you get a big bonus for doing that. These are decently powerful effects, and there are 6 of them if you have all the gems. So the idea that you get a reward for collecting a few different elemental spells, and then if you use them, which might be a disadvantage in combat because they won't be as optimal in that situation, you get a big powerful effect as a bonus. I think that is really cool, but made less cool by the fact that the amulet solves the problem for you. You don't need to have different spells of different types. Adding something like this is a pretty good way to emphasize people playing the subclass to use different elemental spells if it doesn't let them change them into an element, and if they can't change their element. But if it isn't, then it's just very complicated as a way to give them more effectiveness on their spells. They're not all damaged, by the way. Most of them are not damaged, just for the audience. There's the cold one. They have to pass a con save or their speed is halved. They get iced, and then they have to pass the con save to get their speed back. Pretty cool. Moderately powerful as an effect. So a good payoff for using cold spell, but actually it's not a payoff for using a cold spell. Actually, you're just going to use whatever your strongest spell is, make it cold, which won't matter a lot of the time. It feels cool to describe the fireball as a cold bolt, but in reality, it literally just is you casting firebolt or fireball as normal, but it technically does cold damage, which often won't matter, and then they have to pass a con save or their speed is halved. I think it, again, would just be a lot more interesting. There's a lot of potential here if you had to cast the spell of that type. And then chromatic players get more flexibility changing the type, but still can't literally choose which type most of the time. Which gives them flexibility. It's stronger when used by them, and it rewards them for doing something their subclass already rewards them for doing a little bit, and helps them do. They learn spells that make it easy to do different damage types, like Chromatic Convergence, which we'll get to in a minute. But it doesn't make it free, which it currently does. So again, an example of something where it's so close to being something I really like. In my game, not a problem at all. I'll just get rid of that part. But I don't fully see the point with it written the way it is. I feel like it seems complicated for not enough of a reward compared to just doing more damage or slowing enemies, debilitating enemies. You added a really nice flavor bit where you suggested that it could be that the player finds the Amulet of Elemental Mastery, but it doesn't have all of the gems in it, and then they have to go find the rest to power it up over time. So cool. Like, no notes. That's awesome. I'm 100% going to do that in one of my games. Use this item without the ability to adapt to the damage types, and have it be that the player finds it with like only the I don't know, like poison is often one of the worst damage types. So with just the poison gem in there, they're encouraged to use poison spray, get in that big melee range damage space, get a big bonus for doing so. And then they really want like the lightning gem so they can get, you know, chain lightning or whatever with the additional damage. Hell yeah, like that's just awesome. That's so cool. I think that's a very fun idea. You could do a whole subplot of a campaign like that. It will make the player who gets this feel like that is a really fun part of the campaign for them. Really cool. It's a total slam dunk from a lore perspective. Speaking of which, we've talked about it a few times, so chromatic convergence. We've talked about this before on Parley. I don't remember what I said about it before, but I like it now for what it's worth. Okay, so it's an action to cast, 60-foot range. It's concentration. You summon 2 5-foot high pillars, basically cubes of elemental energy that appear at points on the ground that you can see within range. Any points within 60-foot radius of you. So quite a lot of flexibility. When you create these pillars, you choose whether they deal one of the following damage types, chromatic damage types. A creature ending its turn within 5 feet of the pillar takes 1d4 damage of the chosen damage type. No save. When the spell's duration expires, or as a reaction, you can cause the 2 pillars to converge. Any creatures between the 2 pillars must make a dex save. On a fail, they take 1d8 of the chosen damage type, or half on a success. If you upcast it, you get 1d4 more damage and 1d8 more damage on the convergence per level you upcast. The first thing to note is that for a first level spell, it's a first level spell, the relative power increase for upcasting it a few times, if you can only cast second or third level spells, is very high. Like this spell at second level is kind of cracked. Like it's really good. I think it's fine because it's kind of difficult to get too much damage out of it. The creature has to end its turn within 5 feet of the pillar to take damage. So if you cast them on enemies and then they run away, which they almost certainly will, they will not take damage from that part. To get them to take damage from that part, you kind of need to put them in a choke point. Like imagine inside there's a 10-foot hallway and you put a pillar here and here. And so people have to like go like this to get to you or something. Especially against creatures that won't know to not do that, like a horde of zombies, you will absolutely butcher the entire horde of zombies running through that choke point because they will have trouble getting through all of it without stopping their turn there, and then they will take damage from one or often both of the pillars in 2 to 4 of the spaces. They will take damage from both pillars from stopping in there. And if that damage is 4d4 from you upcasting it to second level, a lot of small creatures are going to die. Like they're just dead from just that damage for a minute. It's concentration for 1 minute. So that's really good, but it requires good positioning. I like that you could maybe get some damage and area control out of the placement, and then you have the convergence option to like make it do some damage. Overall, I am a fan. It's flexible damage types. It does less damage than other raw damage options, but it's more flexible, and it also has a niche. Double thumbs up, as far as I'm concerned. The upcasting benefit at second and third level in particular is like mildly concerning, but I feel like it's probably fine. Yeah, and I feel like it's a fairly unique effect. It's for bards, druids, sorcerers, and wizards. Druids? I guess so. That kind of battlefield control, you make something on the battlefield, feels druidy. That's something druids can often do. Bards? Yeah, it's weird. Sure. Maybe bards. Bards often get arcane magic, which is what this feels like. I might cut bards. I'm not sure. But the next spell. Teleban's Crackling Comets. This is a 1 minute casting time, second level spell. Concentration 10 minutes. It's 1 minute of casting. As you cast this spell, you summon a number of crackling orbs of energy equal to your spell casting ability modifier. So like 3 to 5, usually. On a successful hit with any spell attack, you can also hit the creature with one of your summoned orbs. Only one per successful spell attack hit. Dealing an additional 2d6 lightning damage to the target and any creatures within 5 feet of it. The orbs last for a spell's duration until used or you lose concentration. Cool. So pretty interesting. It's very niche because it's a 1 minute casting time, but the duration is only 10 minutes. So you have to know you're going to fight right now, but you have a minute to cast the spell for concentration. You're outside of an obvious boss room, or you can see a magical guardian guarding the door. You're ambushing people, and you can see them coming, but they're a minute away. Negotiations are going badly, but you're a bodyguard, so you're kind of back in the back, and you can incant this for a minute. You are a bard, this is a bard spell, playing a song at a tavern, and you're going to assassinate the guy at the bar at the end of the song. With the final strum of your lute, you summon the comets. Necrotic grasp his neck, and as he's held up, choking to death, one of the comets hits him in the head and knocks him out. Or obviously just completely kills him at that point. I could maybe rule that could be non-lethal damage, but it seems pretty rough. Very cool. There are, I hope you get my point, enough situations where you would be able to use this, but a lot where you can't. I mean, if you're ambushed, it's totally useless. If you prepare it and anything goes wrong with your plan, there's a decent chance that you'll value having the comments to resolve the thing going wrong, but you may very well just not use it. You'll just waste the spell slot or whatever. Negotiations were going badly, so you've got to get going and cast it and commit, but then they, like, actually it goes fine. You waste the spell slot. I guess that's okay. Depending on how you rule when a spell slot is consumed, this may matter. If you rule that it's consumed at the beginning of casting, which I probably would as your DM, that's different than if you rule that it's consumed at the completion of casting for a minute, because that means that you can start casting this all the damn time and then wait 55 seconds or whatever, and then if it seems like you won't need it, you can just stop, which will cause you to be constantly muttering, and maybe that's enough of a social or role-playing debuff that you feel like that's perfectly fine as a game master or dungeon master. Whatever, I think it's cool for bards, sorcerers, and wizards. Obviously, part of the point of this is to create something more robust for the chromatic school wizard. And there aren't that many interesting spells offensively, in my opinion, at second level, and additionally not a lot of lightning spells in the game, period. So I like this as an addition. I think it's cool. Overall, pretty good as far as balancing on the damage of the spells goes too. So for example, 2d6 lightning damage, but you have to hit with a spell attack. You have to have the spell ready in the first place. You knew there was a fight coming, so I mean, it might be a decently sized fight. They do an AoE, but it's a small AoE. 2d6 lightning damage, so you swing a greatsword in an area every time you hit with a spell attack 3 to 5 times in exchange for the spell. If you compare this to doing a second level AoE, the total damage is higher if you get all of them off and you have a decent number of them. But in exchange for you have to hit with multiple spell attacks and you need to have prepared it for a minute, I think that's fine. And it's not like so high, you know what I mean? It's not ridiculously high damage. I think this is okay. It's a little concerning if a mere level 3 player has somehow min-maxed it so that they have like an 18 or 20 in their spellcasting stat, and therefore they get 4 or 5 of these. They're only level 3, and then they're doing like an additional 2d6 AoE damage with like Eldritch Blast or something, of course. And they have Agonizing Blast because of course they do, and then, but they had to multiclass to get that, so I don't know. Or they can't because they can't have multiclassed. Because it's not for warlocks. Yeah, it's probably fine in my opinion. Though I do think that one of the things that helps balance it is that the spellcasters that can get it are squishy. And they have to hit with spell attacks, which does reduce the number of things they can use to trigger it. For example, bards can't use Vicious Mockery to trigger this, getting the really nice debuff from Vicious Mockery, but supplementing the really bad damage of Vicious Mockery with really good damage. That you can't do that because it's not a spell attack. At least I'm almost positive it's not a spell attack. Anyway, whatever. Think about that. If I'm somehow misremembering it is. That is a concern in my opinion, but I think you get my point. I think it's mostly okay, and it limits your attacks a little bit too. Cool. Okay, so we'll spend a few minutes talking about the other stuff. The background, which I thought was very cool flavor. as we wind up, but I just don't have too much else to say. I'm going to read the background blurb. You're the only one of your family who didn't display signs of innate arcana in infancy. Perhaps you were never destined to cast spells, or perhaps you were a late bloomer. But during your childhood, your powers never came to fruition. However, being around a magically proficient family, you picked up a thing or two about sorcery. You get arcana and insight skill proficiencies, chef's utensils and herbalism kit tool proficiencies, an exotic language of your choice, presumably known by your family, and like an herbalism kit and chef's utensils. You know, you get some reasonable items. Pretty cool. The idea that you are from a group of sorcerers, but you yourself are not, at least not yet, but you pick some things up. Pretty cool. The features. So you can probably guess what it would be if you're thinking sorcerer, but really light sorcerer. You get to cast some light meta magic once per day. So you get 1 sorcery point that recharges on a long rest, and you can cast careful, distant, empowered, extended, or subtle spell meta magic using it once per day. This is not a criticism. It isn't, but subtle spell once a day. You don't have to use verbal and somatic components to cast a spell. In a high magic setting where people counter your spell casting, subtle spell once a day is cracked. It's really good. You don't have to invest basically any opportunity cost from your build. And when you do get ambushed by anti-mages that cast silence immediately, you just go, screw you, and cast a fireball on them without even moving your mouth or hands. They all die, and then you get away scot-free. And if they all die, no one finds out about that, and it works every single time, baby. So I don't know. I mean, as your dungeon master, the simplest solution would be for me to say, you get a reputation as the Silent Whisper, or something redundant and overdramatic like that, which is how street names often work. They sound cool at first, but then you think about it and go, whispers are usually quiet. Silent whisper isn't. Whatever. The silent scream is not realistic in my opinion, but would be cooler. And people come to know that you can do a subtle spell, so they're cautious. You get a benefit from it, but you're not constantly like completely blowing people out by casting magic missile when they use silence on you, effectively losing them an entire round and a spell slot every single time you cast magic users that know a damn about how to cast spells. I'm tempted to argue that subtle spell once a day is actually pretty crazy. Like, that's potentially pretty good. A big point is that you might not need it more than once a day, so it's not as much of a restriction, but I'm just being silly. I like this feature. I like it a lot. I think you can subtly influence the magic you do a little bit, and that's fun. You could remove subtle spell. I like that you made it a sorcery point. You can take the meta magic adept feat to supplement that further. Maybe your powers awaken a little more, or maybe you multi-class into sorcerer eventually, and you gain more sorcery points and meta magic, and this supplements those things. Either way, obviously, because it's 1 sorcery point, and you can do 1 meta magic option. Why even have it be a sorcery point? Well, it could combine with those others in the future. I think that's cool. It's neat. You have an optional feature as well, a variant feature, if you wanted a different benefit from this background. I love these benefits. They're hard to balance because you don't want them to be too strong or really strong at all to feel like they're overpowering your character or your character building choices. And the other background features aren't that strong. So they're playing in a small pond, and yet you want them to be good enough that you will use them. Okay, so this one, growing up around an extended magical family, gave you the ability to recognize a spellcaster and their skill. When you look at a creature, you can make a wisdom insight check against their spell save DC, or a 10 if they don't have one. On a success, you determine whether the target can cast spells, and the highest level spell they can cast at disadvantage if the target is disguised or otherwise concealing their abilities. Pretty cool. Again, you get kind of a sense for that, like a nose for that. No notes, super cool. It's really elegant how you found a number for the DC of the check that we don't have to make up or anything. It just feels elegant. It scales with the caster's power level. It scales with your own insight. You get insight proficiency from this background. Super elegant, crispy, delicious game design. I love it. I don't have much to say about this, but I wanted to say, just in case people are like looking to buy this supplement or something, credit where credit's due. It has like the suggested characteristics thing that 5th edition does, where you get personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws, and you can roll die to pick something from those tables if you want. I just think that's cool. There are lots of cool ideas for a character origin using this subclass. I just want to briefly read the blurb, but we're running out of time. Whether you were overly coddled, pushed toward a magical potential you couldn't reach, or left to your own devices, being different from the rest of your family affected you, for better or worse. Yeah, so cool. There's lots of good role-playing options in there. Totally. Anyway, just very, very cool from a flavor perspective. 100% using this background in my game with your blessing. It was nice that you invited me to just go ahead and use these things myself. I totally will be using some of them. They're good. Okay, the spell. I'm not going to spend too long on this. My biggest critique is, well, I'm going to read you it, and then you'll probably a lot of the audience will get what I mean. It's a 6th level enchantment spell called Soporific Contagion. 1 action, 40 feet range, concentration up to 10 minutes. You point at a creature within range to weaponize their dreams. The target must succeed on a wisdom saving throw or fall asleep. Construct, undead, or creature immune to being charmed is immune to this. At the start of the sleeper's turn, spectral figures from their dreams pour out of them. All creatures within 10 feet of the sleeper must make a wisdom saving throw or also fall asleep and continue to propagate the effect on the start of their turns, remember. Each creature affected by this spell remains unconscious until it ends. They take damage or someone uses an action to slap them awake. Druid, sorcerer, warlock, wizard. The critique really doesn't have anything to do with the spell to start. I don't think this belongs in the supplement. It just doesn't feel related to this supplement. It's cool. I don't mind in like a larger, maybe a setting-based supplement, having some spells that are just like, it's just some spells. They're just in there, I guess. But this feels quite out of place. It doesn't really have anything to do with the supplement, in my opinion. It's fine, but I just thought that was odd. So it's like a contagious sleep condition. My complaint is mostly that it feels really hard to manage in a way that I don't think is entirely necessary. I think you want the creature to emit spectral figures from their dreams on the start of their turn because it's their dreams coming out. It's like a flavor thing, but it makes it way harder to manage when you run it. It means that if there are multiple creatures doing this, you have to remember that each of them emits the sleep pulse on their turn, rather than it just being at the start of your turn, the spellcaster. All of the creatures sleeping emit the creatures. I just think that's a lot easier to run. And I'm also a little bit worried about how when there's medium numbers of creatures, it might be very difficult to figure out when people will fall asleep, but surprisingly necessary, because if enough of them don't, then everybody will wake up. You know what I mean? You could simplify the spell, so something like if a creature is affected by 4 or more of these effects at once, or would be affected by 4 or more of these effects at once, they just fall asleep, unless they have like unique resistance to this that the Dungeon Master could just decide for themselves. That could simplify things, but as it is, if there's like 10 people in an area, that might be few enough that they statistically won't all fall asleep before enough of them notice what's going on and wake enough people up using their actions, while others of them are using their turn to put more people to sleep. And how exactly is that balance going? You know what I mean? That's kind of interesting, but also really tedious to manage, I think. I really like the idea that you can put, well, it travels 10 feet and it's 10 minutes, so it's like 100 rounds. 10 feet, 100 rounds. So you put like a large market worth of people to sleep. A large crowded market worth of people fall asleep, more or less. But it happens sort of slowly, so I feel like won't people just run? It's an interesting spell from a role-playing perspective, but politely, I think playtesting is almost always the hardest thing to get right with this kind of thing. And that's where I'm the most worried about this. I feel like actually running this sounds kind of annoying, but from a role-playing perspective, I feel like some cool things could happen from this spell. I like it being a warlock spell. That feels cool. And sleep magic tends to be like sorcerer, wizard, arcane stuff, as well as it does feel druidy. Anyway, I don't hate it. I feel like it's kind of out of place in here. It's kind of cool. It feels kind of annoying to run. That's how I feel. I hope you don't take it as aggressive criticism when I say that I think that playtesting type of critique squares well with what I had felt about the way that School of Chromatic Elements is probably going to cause most players to fixate on picking a single damage type rather than switching damage types that much, which is something you would only find if you playtested with a wide number of players rather than the more limited social circle that you likely have access to, your normal human amount of social interaction. I have no doubt that you played this with your own groups, but you likely didn't have an easy way to do it with lots of other people. This is not an accusation. I hope it doesn't sound hateful or angry. I'm just pointing out that I think the weakness is really just the thing that's essentially impossible to do as an individual, which is playtest it with people you probably wouldn't want to play with, is where I'm going with this. They likely would misunderstand it in a way you'd find frustrating, so why would you have played with them? Which means why would you have had this problem come up? But in my opinion, it will, for a very significant number of people, be a sticking point that you could fairly easily remove to just get the subclass to be more about casting different element spells. Just a final note, it's been poking at the back of my mind for a lot of this parlay that maybe you were worried about making the player feel like they need to pick like too many different elemental spells. They have to spend all of their spell selections on picking different elemental spells. I don't think people will feel like that. Because of Chromatic Orb and Chromatic Convergence, they have an AoE and a single target spell that are adaptable. They can make them whatever element they want. And they can sometimes change spells, well, currently always change spells, to be whatever element they want them to be. So I think that's okay. I don't think you're going to need to worry about, they need to be able to change the element of spells all the time because otherwise they won't have spells of the right elements. I feel like you've over-solved for that in this case, and I would really favor not letting the player transform the element of spells as often. But I talked about that a lot earlier. I just wanted to make a final note that it seems like you're doing that, which I feel like is coming from that's kind of smart, but I feel like you just corrected too much for it, in my opinion. Um, yes, but it's a tenuous balance. That's something I would kind of like to playtest more as well. I've been trying to think about, okay, I have this many spells. I'm picking these cantrips. That's like most of my cantrips, but that's mostly fine, I think. And then what's my spell list look like? And I've been trying to do that the whole time, but that's hard, and I don't want to argue that you should playtest more when I obviously have not playtested this literally at all. I just hope to provide some value in that way. I hope it was fun. I hope this was an interesting way to cover this. I only barely finished within an hour, which is mostly my fault. This is a lot, perhaps a little too much content for a single parlay, but I wanted to grow at my ability to cover it in a limited amount of time, so I tried. I thought it went okay. I'm not sure how I would meaningfully cover this without just saying I'm not covering some of these things, but I tried to skim through some parts that I had less to say about. Anyway, thank you for asking. I hope you still had a good time. I hope you had fun. I had a good time. Thank you for sharing this thing you made with me. I think a lot of the ideas are really cool, and I'm excited to use some of them.